I had planned that camping trip for months, even though I never liked the idea of being alone in the woods during bad weather. But I wanted a break from work, from noise, from people. I wanted a week to myself in the quiet parts of northern Norway, far from the towns and the usual hiking paths. It was early September of 2022, and the days were already shorter up there. When I reached the small clearing I had marked on the map, the sky was still bright, but it felt heavy and swollen with rain. The air smelled like wet soil and pine, and the wind kept pushing the branches in slow, uneasy movements. I set up my tent in the middle of the clearing, which was surrounded on 3 sides by tall trees and thick undergrowth. The 4th side opened toward a long stretch of mossy ground leading down to a narrow river. I liked the spot because it felt hidden. I felt like nobody would walk past accidentally. The nearest cabin was several kilometers away, and the road I used to park my car was nothing more than an old dirt track that hunters sometimes used. I ate a simple meal, boiled water for tea, and pulled out a small notebook to write down the things I wanted to do during the week. Started to drizzle, light at first, but steady. I decided to turn in early since the clouds looked darker by the minute. A few hours after I got inside the tent, the rain grew stronger. The drops hit the fabric in a fast, constant beat that made it hard to relax. The wind arrived next, low at first, then rising in sudden pushes that bent the trees. I could hear branches shifting and leaves scraping against each other like dry sandpaper. I lay on my back, fully awake, staring at the faint shadow of the tent ceiling above me. My sleeping bag felt warm enough, but something about the night kept my mind alert. The smell of damp earth, the cold draft coming through the seams, the sense that the woods around me were changing with every gust. The hours moved slowly. I kept checking the time on my phone, but the signal was dead. I wasn't worried about that. It was normal for remote places. What bothered me was something else. It was the way the forest seemed to fall silent between the heavy stretches of rain. It wasn't the usual peaceful silence. It was tighter, tense, like everything was waiting. Every time the rain paused, I could hear faint things. Little snaps in the distance, soft thuds, the sound of something shifting weight on wet ground. I tried to tell myself it was just branches breaking or animals moving through the trees. It usually was. Around midnight, the rain turned into a full storm. The drops fell so hard that the ground around the tent vibrated. Water ran in thin streams down the sides of the clearing. I could feel some of it sliding under the tent floor. I pushed my backpack against one side to stop the sagging fabric from touching me. My heart kept beating faster than it should. My hands felt cold even inside the sleeping bag. Then something happened that didn't fit the pattern of the storm. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, like a foot pressing into soaked soil. Slow, deep, controlled. The kind of step that wasn't made by a deer or a fox or anything light-footed. I froze instantly. I lay there, muscles locked, breath held in my chest. The rain was still loud, but I knew what I heard. It was close, maybe 10 meters away from the tent, maybe less. I kept listening for a long minute. My ears strained so hard they almost hurt. The storm swallowed most sounds, but underneath it, I sensed movement. A slow drag, maybe a shift of weight, like someone trying to walk without being noticed. I tried to breathe quietly. I tried to tell myself it was just wind knocking something loose or maybe a big branch falling. But branches don't take careful steps. I remembered that the riverbank below the clearing had soft mud. If someone walked there, the footsteps would sound deep. I pictured someone standing at the edge of the clearing, looking toward the tent, barely visible through the rain. The thought made my chest burn. Minutes passed. The storm kept pounding. I stayed completely still. I felt like if I even shifted my elbow, whatever was out there would hear it. My mind kept building images. Someone crouching behind a tree, someone standing with their head tilted, someone crawling up the mossy slope. I hated that I couldn't see anything. The tent walls felt too thin, too fragile, like one quick motion could tear them open. Something pressed on the ground near the tent. Not a step this time, more like a slow, cautious weight right at the edge. I felt the faintest tremor through the floor. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't the storm. It was too steady. My whole body tensed so hard that my legs started to shake. The sound stayed there for a long time, maybe half a minute. Then it faded. I couldn't tell if the person moved away or just shifted position. I waited. The rain kept falling. The wind pushed the tent again and again, but I didn't move. My breathing felt loud inside my own chest. Time lost meaning. Could have been 10 minutes or an hour. Eventually, exhaustion forced my body to move. I turned onto my side slowly, pulling the zipper of the sleeping bag just enough to feel like I could get out quickly if something happened. I didn't sleep, not even for a second. I kept watching the dim shape of the tent wall and listening to every shift in the storm. Around 4 in the morning, the rain softened. The wind died down. The forest became more still than before. I waited for the first bit of daylight to reach the clearing. When I finally unzipped the tent and crawled out, the sky was a dull gray, heavy with leftover moisture. My boots sank into soft mud. My breath came out in small clouds. The clearing looked normal at first.
Wet gras. Fallen needles.
A few broken branches. Then I saw them, fresh footprints near the mossy slope, leading from the direction of the river toward the clearing. They were deep, spaced in a slow walking pattern, and clearly made by a human. The mud still held their shape. The prints were not mine. They were larger, heavier, and the direction they faced was straight toward my tent. I followed them with my eyes. They stopped about 6 meters from where I slept. The last footprints faced my tent directly, and there were no prints leading away. The ground was muddy enough that any step should have left a mark. But whoever was there either stepped onto rocks or backtracked slowly through the same prints. I inspected the area carefully. I didn't find anything. No trash, no shoe piece, no sign of a camp or shelter. Just those prints facing my tent. I felt a slow wave of fear spread through my chest, heavier than what I felt during the night. Someone had been watching. Someone had moved quietly through a storm and stood within a few meters of my tent without making a mistake. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't make themselves known, didn't leave anything behind except the tracks. They didn't try to break in or harm me, but they approached in a way that felt deliberate, almost practiced. I packed my gear quickly. Every second felt like I was being watched again from the tree line. The air still felt heavier than normal. The mud clung to my boots. The wind stayed completely still, which made everything feel wrong. When I finally walked out of the clearing and made my way back to the dirt road where my car was parked, the forest remained silent behind me. I didn't look back once. When I reached the car, the windows were covered in beads of rain, and the doors were just as I left them. I threw my backpack in the back seat, started the engine, and drove without stopping until I reached the nearest village. Only then did the tension in my chest loosen enough for me to breathe normally. For days after I returned home, my mind kept circling those footprints. The slow steps, the way they stopped and faced the tent, the missing exit prints. I kept trying to explain it with something simple. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone lost, maybe someone passing through. But none of those explanations made sense. No normal person walks right up to a stranger's tent in the middle of a violent storm, stands there silently, and then disappears without leaving any trace of where they went next. In the end, I decided one thing clearly. I would never camp alone again. Not in Norway, not anywhere. The woods at night aren't dangerous because of animals or weather. They're dangerous because you never really know who else is out there, moving quietly, watching from a few meters away, waiting for a moment you won't notice until it's already passed. And sometimes the scariest part isn't what they do. It's what they choose not to do. had always been drawn to the untamed parts of the world, places where civilization felt like a fragile illusion. In 2018, at 27, I decided to take a solo trip deep into the Amazon basin in northern Brazil. I wanted to camp in the heart of the jungle, far from the few tourist lodges that dotted the riverbanks. I had studied survival guides and learned enough Portuguese to get by, but nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. The day I arrived, the air was thick with humidity, and the smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation clung to my clothes almost immediately. My guide, a wiry man named Raul, who knew the forest like the back of his hand, dropped me at a narrow, winding tributary far from any road or trail. He told me to follow the river for about an hour to reach a clearing suitable for camping. Raul left me with basic supplies: a small tent, a sleeping bag, some canned food, a machete, and a first aid kit. The forest was alive in ways I had only read about. Birds with shocking, vivid feathers darted overhead, their cries echoing through the canopy. Insects buzzed constantly, and the trees towered so high I couldn't see the tops. The sunlight barely penetrated the dense foliage. As I trudged along the muddy riverbank, the occasional rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. I reminded myself that jaguars and large snakes often moved silently. My heart raced every time I heard the snapping of twigs, but I tried to stay calm and focused. By late afternoon, I found the clearing Raul had described. It was a small patch of dry earth surrounded by towering kapok and rubber trees. I set up my tent and stacked some firewood nearby. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, and shadows stretched across the jungle floor like dark fingers. I ate a can of beans warmed over a small fire, listening to the cacophony of frogs and insects. Night in the Amazon was oppressive. The air became heavy and sticky, and every sound was amplified. Somewhere in the darkness, a river otter, or maybe a capybara, slid through the water, making the reeds shake. I zipped up my tent and tried to sleep, but sleep was difficult. The forest seemed to press against the thin fabric, and every crack or rustle set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I finally drifted into a light sleep. I woke hours later with a sharp, almost electric feeling of unease. Something wasn't right. My tent had shifted slightly in the mud, and the air smelled different, faintly like ammonia. I sat up slowly, listening. Then I saw it, a thick, dark shape sliding silently over the edge of my clearing, moving closer to my tent. My stomach dropped. It was a snake, enormous, at least 4 or 5 meters long. Its skin glistened in the weak moonlight, mottled brown and green, and its head was lifted slightly, tongue flicking in and out. I recognized it immediately from the survival guide, a green anaconda. I froze, remembering everything I had read. Green anacondas were non-venomous, but they were deadly constrictors. They could kill a human with sheer force. I had no way to scare it away without exposing myself, and my tent offered almost no protection. My first thought was to grab my machete, but even moving could provoke it. I watched, heart hammering, as the snake's body slid closer to my supplies, eyes fixed on the rustling bag of canned food. Minutes passed like hours. I could hear my own breathing, loud in my ears, and the faint squelch of the muddy ground beneath the snake's body. It was methodical, almost hypnotic in its movement. I remembered Raul's words: "Do not panic, do not run, do not try to touch it, wait until it moves on." But my mind raced. I needed a plan in case it came into the tent. I slowly unzipped the top flap of the tent just enough to peek out without fully exposing myself. The snake was now at the edge of the firelight. I had left a small cooking pot near the fire to boil water earlier, and I picked it up with a trembling hand. I tapped it lightly against a rock, making a loud, hollow clang. The snake paused, its head turning toward the sound. I froze, unsure if the noise had angered it or confused it. After a tense few seconds, it began to move again, slower now, toward the river. My pulse was in my throat, and I realized I had been holding my breath for who knows how long. I didn't sleep again that night. Instead, I stayed upright in the tent, listening. Every splash, every rustle kept me alert. By dawn, the snake had vanished into the reeds along the riverbank. The morning sun brought some relief, but I couldn't shake the memory of those smooth, powerful coils sliding so close to where I had slept. I spent the next day cautiously moving along the river, checking my surroundings constantly. I made sure my supplies were secured in higher branches or tied to logs to prevent another encounter. Despite the scare, I couldn't leave the clearing entirely. It was beautiful in daylight, with small waterfalls feeding into the river and bright orchids clinging to tree trunks. But the tension never left me. On the third day, I decided to explore a narrow side stream. The water was shallow, clear, and surprisingly cold for the Amazon. I was fascinated by the variety of fish and the occasional flash of a caiman's tail in the deeper pools. That evening, I returned to the clearing, setting up my tent in the same spot. My nerves were still raw, but I was determined to finish the trip I had planned. That night, I kept a larger fire going and surrounded it with a ring of logs. I placed my cooking pot and a few stones around it to amplify noise in case anything approached. The forest seemed alive with energy, every sound magnified in the stillness of the night. Hours passed, and no snake came near. I realized slowly that staying calm, moving deliberately, and respecting the creatures around me had likely prevented another encounter. By the fourth morning, I was ready to leave. I had learned more about survival than I had anticipated. Not just how to cut through vegetation or boil water, but how to coexist with a forest that could kill you as easily as it could sustain you. When Raoul returned to take me back, I felt a strange mixture of relief and accomplishment. The jungle had tested me in ways I had not expected, and I had survived. Looking back now, I understand the clarity that fear can bring. When faced with a predator as powerful as a green anaconda, panic is deadly, and preparation is everything. I also learned to appreciate the delicate balance of life in the Amazon, the way predators and prey, humans and snakes, all share the same space. The memory of that night, lying in my tent while a massive snake glided inches away, remains vivid, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. I never saw another snake that close again, and I made it home safely. But I will never forget the hiss of its breath in the dark, the subtle shifting of its body, and the cold realization that in the Amazon, even the quietest sound can announce your presence to a creature capable of ending your life in an instant. That trip changed the way I see nature, danger, and the thin line that separates the two. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip into the northern wilderness of Montana. I was 32 at the time, and while I had hunted a few times with friends, I wanted to test myself alone this time, just me, my rifle, and the forest. I packed carefully, checked my gear 3 times, and left my small cabin in Bozeman early in the morning. The air was crisp, the kind of sharp cold that wakes up your senses instantly. I drove my old pickup truck northwest, following winding roads that eventually dissolved into gravel, and then dirt paths that barely counted as trails. I reached the spot I had chosen just as the sun began to dip behind distant ridges. It was a remote clearing surrounded by dense pine and fir trees, with a small stream snaking through one side. Perfect for deer, or so I hoped. I parked, unloaded my pack, and began to set up my small, green canvas tent. My heart was buzzing with excitement and a slight tension that always comes when you're completely alone in the wild. By the time I finished setting up my camp, the sun had dropped completely, leaving a bruised purple sky. I made a small fire using dry twigs and some kindling I had brought. The first night was quiet, almost eerily so. The wind whispered through the treetops, and I could hear the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. I made myself a simple dinner of canned beans heated over the fire, ate slowly, and then crawled into my sleeping bag. I kept my rifle close just in case. I slept fitfully, waking at odd hours to the distant crack of branches, the snap of something heavy moving through the woods, and the low murmur of the stream. The next morning, I packed lightly and headed out into the forest. I was following deer tracks I had spotted near the stream. The ground was damp with last night's frost, and my boots left deep impressions in the soil. The forest was dense, almost claustrophobic at times, and I had to push through low-hanging branches. My rifle felt heavy on my shoulder, but I liked that weight. It reminded me that I was prepared. By late morning, I found signs of a buck. Broken twigs, shallow hoof marks in the mud, a few tufts of fur caught on low branches. I followed the trail carefully, moving slowly and trying to be as quiet as possible. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of birds or small animals were muted, as if the forest itself had gone on pause. I had a tight feeling in my chest, a mix of excitement and unease, but I told myself it was just the isolation. Around midday, I spotted the buck. It was grazing near a thicket, unaware of my presence. I crouched behind a tree, raised my rifle slowly, and took a steady breath. I aimed and fired. The shot echoed loudly through the trees, more than I expected. The buck bolted, but I saw it collapse a few meters away. I approached cautiously. My adrenaline was high, and my senses felt sharper than ever. I inspected my kill, satisfied with a clean shot. I prepared it for transport, dragging it carefully back toward camp. It was exhausting work, but I was used to physical strain. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was low again. I cleaned up, secured the deer, and started my fire. That night, I felt a strange tension in the air. I kept hearing noises, small at first like twigs snapping, but then heavier sounds. Thuds in the underbrush, something moving closer to my camp. I kept my rifle beside me, listening intently. My instincts told me this wasn't a deer or a small animal. The forest seemed to press in on me, and I realized I had no cell signal. I was completely alone, vulnerable. Hours passed. The noises continued intermittently, always at the edge of hearing. Every shadow seemed to shift unnaturally. Every breeze sounded like something breathing. I tried to rationalize it. Deer moving, raccoons, maybe a bear scavenging. But then I heard it. A low, deliberate snap, like someone stepping on a branch very close. I froze. My heart was pounding in my ears. I thought about running, but I knew that moving blindly could make things worse. I gripped my rifle and slowly crawled to the edge of the clearing, staying low behind my tent. Through the fading light, I saw a dark figure moving among the trees. My first thought was a hunter, but this wasn't another person out for sport. The movements were deliberate, cautious, like someone stalking. My mind raced. I had packed bear spray, but it was in my backpack, not in my hand. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing. The figure paused, glanced in my direction, and then melted back into the darkness. I waited, tense, until I was sure it wasn't coming back. My mind wouldn't stop spinning. I didn't sleep much that night. Every rustle, every whisper of wind set me on edge. I stayed awake, watching the perimeter of my camp, rifle ready. When dawn finally broke, I packed quickly. I decided to leave the area and head back down the mountain. I didn't want to encounter whatever had been there again. The walk down was long and exhausting, and I constantly scanned the woods for movement. Every snapping twig made my pulse spike. By the time I reached my truck, I was covered in sweat despite the cold. I loaded my gear quickly, keeping my eyes on the trees as I started the engine. The isolation of the forest had vanished in the harsh sunlight, replaced by the familiar sight of the dirt road winding back toward civilization. I drove slowly, still wary, until the first sign of another car or cabin appeared. Only then did I allow myself to exhale fully. Later, I learned from a local ranger that poaching and illegal hunting were not uncommon in that region. People often moved silently at night, taking what they wanted from the forest. I realized then that what I had experienced wasn't supernatural. It was human and far more dangerous. The thought that someone could have been watching me all night, waiting for an opportunity, made my skin crawl even days later. When I finally reached home in Bozeman, I unpacked my gear and checked the deer. I was exhausted but relieved. The forest had tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated, but I had survived, careful and alert. That trip changed the way I approached hunting, camping, and isolation. I no longer sought solitude for thrill alone. I respected the wilderness and the people who might move within it for their own reasons. From then on, every hunting trip I took included careful planning, extra precautions, and awareness of not just the animals but the humans who shared the same wild spaces. The memory of that night, walking back to my truck with every sense on high alert, remained vivid. I knew that being alone in the wilderness was a privilege, but also a risk. And that night in Montana, I had learned the hard way just how real that risk could be. It was the summer of 2018, and I had decided to take a solo camping trip in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. I was 29 at the time, working long hours in a city job I didn't particularly love, and I just needed a break. The kind of break where no one could reach you, no phones, no responsibilities. I packed my old Jeep with a tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, some canned food, water, and my hunting rifle. Not that I was planning to hunt anything, but for protection. The roads out there were rough, gravelly, twisting through dense pine forests, and after about 4 hours, I finally pulled off onto a barely marked dirt trail that led to a small clearing I had found on an old topographical map. The clearing was perfect. It was a flat patch of earth surrounded by thick pine and fir trees, tall and dense enough that the wind barely rustled the needles. A small creek ran a few hundred feet away, its water clear and cold. I parked, unloaded my gear, and spent the late afternoon setting up camp. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure the rain fly was taut. Even though the forecast had been clear, I had learned to always prepare for sudden mountain storms. By the time I finished, the sun was dipping behind the ridges, and shadows were spilling across the forest floor. I built a small fire in a cleared circle of stones I found nearby, the smell of burning pine filling the air. I cooked a simple dinner of beans and canned chicken, and as I ate, I felt that first twinge of isolation that makes you hyper-aware of everything around you. The forest seemed alive, not in a mystical way, but in a very real, animalistic way. The creak of trees, the occasional rustle in the underbrush, the low croak of frogs from the creek. It all sounded unnervingly close. I decided to take a short walk before dark, following the creek upstream. The path was narrow, and in some places, I had to push past low-hanging branches. After about 15 minutes, I reached a point where the creek curved sharply and widened into a small pool. The water was almost black in the shade, reflecting the trees like a mirror. I crouched, splashing water on my face and taking a few gulps. That's when I noticed something odd. On the opposite bank, about 50 feet away, there was a trail of footprints in the mud. Large, heavy, and widely spaced, like someone or something had been walking along the creek. They were fresh, and they weren't human. The toes were long, the heel broad, almost like the tracks of a bear, but something about the stride didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, too straight. A sudden rustling behind me made me spin around. Nothing. I was alone, obviously, just the wind in the trees, or so I told myself. I went back to camp quickly, keeping my rifle loosely in hand. That night, I made sure the fire burned longer, throwing extra wood on it, the sparks rising into the sky like tiny stars. I double-checked my tent, my gear, even the rifle. Sleep came slowly. Every sound in the woods felt amplified. The snapping of a branch made my heart jump. The hoot of an owl sounded closer than it should have. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a heavy thud outside my tent. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, listening. Another thud, then another, this time in a slow, irregular pattern, like something was deliberately walking around the perimeter of my camp. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, mountain lion, some other animal. But the thuds were too measured, too rhythmic, not the chaotic patter of an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slightly, peering out. The light caught movement, just shadows shifting between trees. My stomach sank as I realized something was circling the fire. I didn't want to leave the tent, but I also didn't want to provoke it. I whispered to myself, "Stay calm, just stay calm." The fire was almost out, the embers glowing dimly. I grabbed a few logs and tossed them onto the coals, the sudden flare lighting up the clearing. That's when I saw it clearly. A figure, crouched low, moving slowly between the trees. Not running, not attacking, just observing. It was big, easily over 6 feet, but the thing that made my stomach twist was how silent it was. No rustle of branches, no cracking twigs. It was moving like the shadows themselves were bending. My mind screamed to grab the rifle, but I froze, staring, feeling every hair on my body stand on end. Hours seemed to stretch as I watched it circle, always keeping the trees between us, never stepping into the firelight. At dawn, when the sky began to pale, it vanished. I dared not sleep again, staying by the fire, scanning the forest. Around mid-morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed up as quickly as possible, not caring if the tent or gear got dirty, and started hiking back toward the main road. The hike was tense. Every sound made me jump. I imagined the figure watching, following, waiting for me to make a mistake. The trail narrowed, twisted, and the forest seemed endless. About an hour from the clearing, I heard footsteps again, this time behind me. Not like the earlier thuds, but something lighter, faster. I spun around, but nothing was there. The hairs on my neck were prickling. I started jogging, then broke into a full sprint, slipping on loose rocks and roots, my lungs burning, my heart hammering. When I finally emerged onto the dirt road, I saw a truck parked halfway down the next bend. Relief hit me so hard it was almost nauseating. I ran toward it, waving my hands, screaming. The driver, a middle-aged man, looked startled, then quickly opened his door for me. I jumped in without even explaining. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely start my Jeep. Later, safely back in town, I reported the footprints to the local ranger station. They inspected the photos I had taken, measured the prints, and admitted they had no idea what could have made them. They called it an unidentified large animal. But privately, the ranger told me stories of people seeing figures in the Bitterroots, shadowy shapes moving between trees, always silent, always watching. Most thought it was deer, elk, or bears. Some thought it was a person living off the grid. No one really knew. I never went back. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder of how alone and small you are when you're in the wilderness. But I also learned something important that trip: preparation, observation, and respect for the forest can save your life. I left all my gear in the Jeep the next day, sold the tent, and never camped alone in those mountains again. The story had a clear ending. I got out safely, unharmed, but the memory of those silent footsteps, circling, watching, still sends a shiver down my spine. Sometimes, even when you make all the right choices, nature, or whatever lurks in it, reminds you who's really in charge. It was the summer of 2019 when my wife, Jenna, suggested we take a weekend camping trip with her friend, Carla. We had all been stressed out from work. Jenna in marketing, Carla teaching high school, and me in construction, and the idea of getting away to the mountains seemed perfect. We decided on a small, relatively unknown campsite near Lake Harmony, up in the remote hills of Pennsylvania. I had never been there before, and neither had they, but that made it feel like an adventure. We drove in Carla's old Subaru, the three of us packed with sleeping bags, a small tent, cooking gear, and more food than any reasonable person could eat for 2 nights. The road wound up through dense forest, the trees so thick in some places that the sunlight barely reached the asphalt. The smell of pine and wet earth hit me immediately when we stepped out. I had been camping before, but something about this place felt different. More isolated, quieter, and at the same time heavier, like the forest itself was watching us. We picked a site that looked ideal. It was just off a narrow dirt road, a clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks. The lake wasn't far, just down a small slope, its surface calm and dark. I carried the tent, and Jenna and Carla unpacked the car, humming quietly to themselves. Setting up camp was easy at first. I pegged the tent, spread out the sleeping bags, and collected some firewood. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward us like fingers. As darkness fell, the forest changed. The birds stopped singing, the wind whispered through the treetops, and insects became louder, almost deafening. I started the fire, the flames snapping and crackling, and the three of us sat around it eating the first batch of food. Carla had brought sausages, Jenna brought sandwiches, and I had grabbed a pack of marshmallows for dessert. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake a small, nagging feeling in the back of my mind that we weren't as alone as we thought. It started around 10 o'clock. I had gone to refill the water jug at the lake, flashlight in hand. The path down was narrow, muddy from earlier rain, and the trees pressed close, blocking the moonlight. When I got to the lake, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the mud along the shore, barefoot, human, but too large to be ours. They didn't look fresh, but they weren't completely old either. I froze, listening. Nothing. No voices, no snapping branches, nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the shape of the footprints was wrong. They were too flat, too long, like someone had stretched their feet. I shook my head and went back to the tent, convincing myself I was just imagining things. Back at camp, Jenna and Carla were asleep. The fire had died down, leaving only a few embers glowing faintly. I decided to sit outside for a while, trying to calm the uneasy feeling in my chest. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling from the trees. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then there was a snap, like a branch breaking under a heavy foot. I froze, staring into the dark forest. The rustling moved closer, slow and deliberate, until it stopped just beyond the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see anything, but the hairs on my arms stood up. My first instinct was to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. What if it wasn't friendly? I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it again, that the isolation and the strange footprints were messing with my head. Still, I felt eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anyone. I went back into the tent, shaking. I woke Jenna and Carla, whispering what I saw, but neither of them reacted much. They said it was probably a raccoon or a deer, and tried to fall back asleep. I stayed awake, listening. Every little sound, the wind, an animal, or even a branch cracking. Felt like someone was moving closer. Couldn't shake it. Around 2 in the morning, I finally heard it clearly. Footsteps, crunching leaves, moving slowly around the perimeter of our campsite. Not like a deer or raccoon. These were human footsteps, heavy, measured, and deliberate. I looked at Jenna and Carla, both still asleep, oblivious. I grabbed the baseball bat I had packed for protection, tiptoeing to the tent flap. Outside, the moonlight barely illuminated the clearing. The footprints I had seen earlier seemed to have returned, closer now, encircling the tent in a rough, uneven loop. Whoever or whatever had made them was still there. I didn't panic yet, but my heart was racing. I thought about calling 911, but there was barely any signal up here, and if someone was outside, the last thing I wanted was to announce my location. I decided to wait. I stayed perfectly still, listening, holding the bat tight. After what felt like hours, the steps stopped. Absolute silence fell. I stayed on edge until dawn, barely sleeping, half expecting someone to burst into the tent. When the sun finally started to rise, I crawled out of the tent to inspect the area. The footprints were gone. Nothing left but the normal tracks of animals and the damp forest floor. The strange, heavy, barefoot prints had vanished. It didn't make sense. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. Jenna and Carla woke soon after, groggy but cheerful, completely unaware of the night's terror. I didn't tell them everything, just said I had a bad dream. They laughed, still half asleep, and we started breakfast. The forest seemed friendly again in daylight, with birds singing and a gentle breeze moving through the trees. We packed up quickly, all of us a little quieter than usual, and headed back to the main road. On the drive home, I kept replaying the night in my head. Whoever had been out there had clearly been watching us, testing us, but for some reason they hadn't approached directly. The thought was chilling, but I was also oddly grateful that the encounter had ended without confrontation. That realization that we had been completely at someone else's mercy stuck with me long after we returned. Back at home, life slowly returned to normal. I kept a baseball bat by the front door for a while, and I never camped in a remote area again without doing thorough research first. I talked about the experience to a few friends, and they all suggested it was likely some local, perhaps a transient living in the woods, but that didn't make it any less real or frightening. Looking back, I still can't explain why we weren't discovered, why whoever it was didn't make contact. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were smarter than I imagined. The memory stayed with me, though. Every time I hear footsteps at night or see shadows moving through the trees, I remember that weekend at Lake Harmony. The strange footprints in the mud, the silent rustling just beyond the firelight, and the realization that sometimes danger isn't dramatic. It's quiet, patient, and watching. It taught me to respect the forest and to never take isolation lightly, even in what seemed like a simple weekend getaway. I had been planning this trip for months. In the summer of 2018, at the age of 26, I decided to take a solo camping trip through the Jura Mountains in eastern France. I wanted something quiet, something that would let me escape the constant noise of Paris. I drove a battered old Peugeot with a tent, a sleeping bag, and enough food to last me a week. I had no plan beyond picking a spot and staying off the beaten path. That's how I ended up on a narrow dirt road, winding between dense pine and beech forests, the kind of road that seems to disappear into the mountains. I reached a small clearing just as the sun was dipping behind the hills. The place was perfect. A flat patch of grass surrounded by trees, a small creek babbling nearby, and the faint smell of wet soil and pine needles in the air. I parked the car, unpacked my gear, and set up my tent. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the occasional bird or rustle of leaves. As I worked, I noticed a faint trail leading deeper into the woods. It didn't seem like it had been used recently, but it was wide enough for someone to walk through without difficulty. I didn't think much of it at first. I set up my campfire, cooked some pasta over it, and settled in to watch the sky turn pink and purple. The air was cool and damp, the kind that clings to your skin. I lay on my sleeping mat, staring at the darkening trees, feeling the satisfaction of being completely alone. But as the last light faded, I heard a sound that made me sit up. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving along the edge of the clearing. I froze, trying to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the rhythm was unmistakably human. Whoever it was, they weren't moving like a normal hiker. There was a weight to their steps, a kind of careful patience, like they were watching me. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the thickening darkness. Then I saw him, a figure standing at the far edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a tree. He was tall, thin, and dressed in dark clothing that blended with the forest shadows. His posture was strange, rigid, almost like he was trying not to be noticed, but also daring me to see him. I couldn't make out his face, but I felt it staring at me. My stomach twisted, a cold knot forming. I tried to calm myself. Maybe he was just another camper, lost, or maybe he was a local out for an evening walk. But something about the way he moved, the way he stood, made every instinct in my body scream that I wasn't safe. I didn't dare get up or make noise. I told myself to wait, to watch, to figure out if he was leaving or not. Minutes passed. The footsteps circled the clearing. I could hear the crunch of leaves under boots, the snap of a twig. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he would hear it. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. I strained my ears, but the forest returned to its natural silence, as if nothing had happened. Couldn't sleep. I stayed up the rest of the night, fire dying down to glowing embers, ears pressed to the wind, eyes scanning every shadow. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had imagined him, but deep down I knew I hadn't. The next morning, I packed up as quickly as I could. The sun was just rising, casting a cold, gray light through the mist that had rolled in overnight. I decided not to take the same trail back to the main road. Instead, I followed a narrow creek downstream, hoping it would lead me somewhere populated. Halfway along the creek, I spotted something that made my stomach sink. Footprints in the soft mud, large and deliberate, leading parallel to the creek. Someone had been walking near me, following my route, maybe all night. I froze, heart racing. The footprints weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Whoever had made them had been here while I slept. Panic set in. I considered running, but I didn't know which direction was safe. The forest felt endless. Then I remembered my car, my only means of escape. I had left it at the clearing. I had to get back to it, but I didn't want to risk moving through open spaces where he might see me. I crouched behind trees, moving slowly, keeping low. Every rustle, every snap of a branch made me flinch. I reached the clearing by mid-morning. The car was still there. The tent had been disturbed, not destroyed, just rifled through. My gear was scattered, my backpack partially open. Whoever had been there had looked through everything. My heart sank deeper, but the car was locked, and there were no footprints leading directly to it from the trees, just the faint trail disappearing into the forest. I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear into the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. That's when I saw him again. Across the clearing, near the treeline, the same figure was standing, watching me. He wasn't moving, not even breathing as far as I could tell. Just standing there, a shadow among shadows. I drove off slowly at first, not wanting to provoke him. Then I floored the accelerator, tires spinning on the dirt road. I didn't look back. For a long while, the road wound endlessly through trees and hills, and I kept expecting him to appear in the distance. stepping out from the forest like he had the night before. I didn't stop until I reached a small town about 20 kilometers away. I parked at a gas station, hands shaking, sweat running down my back despite the cool air. I called the local police and reported the incident. They told me they had received other reports of a man matching that description, often seen lurking near isolated campsites in the region. Apparently, he had been scaring solo campers for years, but no one had ever caught him. After that trip, I never went camping alone again. I couldn't shake the image of him standing in the shadows, his rigid posture, the silent patience in the way he watched. I kept my tent gear packed away, my backpack untouched, a constant reminder of how quickly the peace of the forest could turn into something terrifying. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. He could have done more than just watch. The isolation of the forest, the quiet of the night, the vulnerability of a single camper, all of it worked in his favor. I survived because of instinct, because I stayed calm enough to leave when I had the chance, and because the forest, in its randomness, gave me a path back to safety. That summer in the Jura Mountains changed the way I see solitude. I learned that sometimes the scariest thing isn't supernatural. It's real people and the unknown intentions behind their quiet actions. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream about that clearing, about the crunch of leaves behind me, and the feeling of being watched. It's a sharp, vivid memory that reminds me, you can never be too careful when you're alone, and the forest doesn't care who you are. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 28. I had decided to take a solo camping trip deep in the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana. I needed to get away from the city, from the constant buzzing of life, from the endless emails and deadlines. I wasn't looking for adventure. I just wanted quiet, some time to think, and maybe a couple of nights under the stars. I packed my old Subaru with a small tent, a sleeping bag, a camping stove, some canned food, and enough water for 3 days. I also brought my hunting knife, not because I was planning to hunt, but because it made me feel safer. The drive up the mountain road was long, twisting, and lined with dense pine forests. I passed only a few cars and didn't see anyone else until I reached the small dirt parking area near the trailhead. A faded sign warned of bears and cougars, but I wasn't worried. I had grown up in rural Montana and knew how to handle wildlife. I hiked in a few miles until I found a small clearing near a creek. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air smelled faintly of wet moss. I set up my tent in a corner of the clearing, far enough from the water but close enough to hear the creek babbling. I stacked a small pile of firewood and started a fire as the sun sank behind the mountains. The first night was peaceful. The sky was clear, and stars blazed like diamonds overhead. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the creek and the occasional rustle in the trees, and drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore further. I packed my backpack with water, snacks, and my camera, and followed a narrow trail deeper into the forest. Birds sang, the wind whispered through the trees, and I felt completely alone in the world. About a mile down the trail, I noticed something strange. The ground was disturbed, like something had been dragged. I followed it carefully and saw a patch of flattened grass. At first, I thought maybe an animal had bedded down there, but then I noticed the pieces of torn clothing tangled in the branches. My stomach sank. I wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions, but something about it made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I decided to turn back to camp, but as I retraced my steps, I started to hear snapping twigs behind me. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the steps were heavy, deliberate, and they weren't stopping. I picked up my pace, keeping my eyes on the trail, but I could hear it. Someone or something was following me. My heart began to race. I forced myself not to run, thinking maybe if I panicked, I'd make myself more vulnerable. By the time I got back to my clearing, the sky was gray and clouds had gathered. I quickly packed my firewood into the tent and zipped up the flap. I didn't light a fire, worried it might attract unwanted attention. I ate some canned beans and sat in the dim light, listening. The creek was still babbling, but the forest around me seemed unnaturally quiet, except for a faint, irregular snapping sound far off in the trees. I told myself it was probably another hiker or a bear moving through the underbrush, but the thought didn't make me feel any safer. The third day, I woke early to pack up. I had planned to hike out, but when I stepped out of the tent, I noticed something that froze me in place. Footprints. They weren't mine and they weren't animal prints. They were human, big, heavy boots. They circled my tent and then vanished into the trees. My stomach twisted, and I realized someone had been watching me while I slept. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed my food and water inside, and grabbed my knife. I didn't make a fire. I didn't linger. I walked quickly toward the trail, every snap of a branch making me flinch. About an hour into the hike back, I saw something I'll never forget. A man, tall, thin, and wearing a dirty gray hoodie, stepped out from behind a tree. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me. My heart jumped, and I froze. I considered running, but my legs felt like lead. He didn't move closer, but the look in his eyes was intense, empty, almost predatory. I fumbled for my phone, realizing I had almost no signal, but enough to send a text with my GPS location to a friend back in Missoula. My hands shook so badly I had trouble typing. The man finally turned and walked slowly into the forest, not running, not hurried, just walking. I didn't move until he disappeared from view. I didn't look back. I walked the rest of the trail as fast as I could, keeping my knife ready, listening for any sounds behind me. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump, but I didn't see him again. By the time I reached the car, I was exhausted, shaking, and covered in sweat. I locked the doors and sat for a few minutes, trying to calm down before starting the drive back down the mountain road. On the way back, I called the local ranger station. They told me that, yes, there had been reports of a man living in the forest, someone who followed campers and hikers. No one knew exactly who he was or what he wanted. Some said he had attacked people before, but he'd always disappeared into the woods before authorities could catch him. They advised me to report what I saw and to stay on main roads. The drive back to Missoula felt unreal. The sun was setting, painting the mountains orange, and I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see him following me in a car or on a motorcycle. By the time I reached the city limits, I had started to calm down, but the fear lingered. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. I double-checked locks, carried my knife everywhere, and avoided hiking alone. Looking back now, I realize how lucky I was. A few minutes later on the trail or a wrong turn into the woods, and I might not have made it out that day. The experience changed me. I still love the mountains, but I never go in alone. I always check in with someone, and I always keep an eye on my surroundings. What I learned that summer is simple but unforgettable. Nature is beautiful, yes, but the real danger doesn't always come from the animals or the elements. It can come from other humans, and there's no predicting their intentions. I still go camping, but I respect the forest in a way I didn't before. It's not just trees and streams. It's a place where you can be completely alone, and in that solitude, some people, some things can find you. Even now, I can still feel the weight of those eyes in the forest, the sound of snapping twigs behind me, the way my stomach twisted when I realized I wasn't alone. I'll never forget it, and I've never hiked in those parts of the Bitterroots alone again.